Give me 1 second. Let's see if we can make them be quiet. Good. Come on up, you can come talk to me now. We are currently out here trying to recreate the Gallipoli campaign from the perspective of the Australian ANZAC. Now, we're back in the First World War. Some of you might be very excited about that. Frankly, I feel kind of miserable because for the next 72 hours, I get to sleep in this beautiful trench here and relive their lifestyle. But that's okay, because we make this to honor the memory of our forefathers in the First World War, in particular for all veterans who are ANZACs overseas. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Now, many of you are probably thinking, what is a Gallipoli? Well, before the D-Day invasion 29 years prior, on April 25th of 1915, the Allies decided it was time to try and open up a second front and invade the Dardanelles in modern-day Turkey. What happened would become one of the most major catastrophes, but also heroic tales of that day and age, and it was something that brought about two nations to their real sense of self, while at the same time seeing the fall of one nation, the Ottoman Empire, and the rise of the Turkish nation. In this case here, we're going to be getting into history for you ever so lovingly dirty, and hopefully you'll take something away from this. Now, if you excuse me, I have a feeling I need to dig in a little deeper here and get comfortable, because someone's liable to come back and get me real soon. Excuse me. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome here to the Burlap Palace here at Eager Beaver HQ. As you might have seen already from our intro, today we're going to be discussing the Gallipoli Campaign, which took place from 1915 into 1916, and really is one of the most incredible stories of the First World War. However, very few people really seem to discuss it or talk on it much. And in part, some people even look on it in shame. And we here on the channel really think that that is an injustice to this amazing story. The Gallipoli Campaign is so majorly significant to history because it's the first time we really see in the modern day and age the utilization and overall combined might of air power, naval power, and land powers into one major invasion force. In this case, we have the likes of mass surveillance through the Navy and the Air Force, further being backed by the logistics of those two and their own abilities to wage their own independent campaigns. Further, they work in support and in tandem for launching a naval force in small units to then begin disembarkment of major troops and embark on their own campaign at land to fight. This kind of action had never really been done and combined in history before to such a modern level. Further, the likes of new technologies such as the machine gun, the airplane, and wireless transmissions for messages were going to play a major role in this campaign. However, that being said, they also led to their own complexities. But the Gallipoli campaign would play a major part in inspiring and informing the June 6, 1944 Normandy invasion of World War II, 29 years later. We here at Eager Beaver would like to make a quick note that the two major sources we utilized in our research for this particular essay are here. We have The Fall of the Ottoman Empire by a Mr. Eugene Rogan, and then the classic Gallipoli by Alan Moorhead. You can also tell that we have been doing quite a bit of extensive research and reading these and making earmarks. All of that said, we can't go in incredible detail with every minute piece, but we're going to try and use all of this information here to really give you a great example of that living history. Now, let's take this and talk about what set up and led to the Gallipoli campaign and the overall invasion of 1915. Times were extremely bleak as of December of the year 1914 during the First Great World War. For the Allies, 1 million casualties had been amassed within the course of just 4 months. Even worse, the very front lines were now in an absolute deadlock. This is largely due to the fact that 350 miles of trenches had been dug, ranging from the Alps all the way over into the North Atlantic. It looked like there was no possibility to progress. The war was in an absolute stalemate deadlock, and casualties would continue to rise. The only hope for any soon victory would possibly be to open up a second front, if somehow that were possible. As near impossible as that would have seemed, soon a possibility really began, because in the Caucasus, the Russians, as of December 27th, were quite nearly encircled by the Turkish forces, who had recently decided to join the Germans in the war. The Russians had asked for aid and the possibility of further support on foot for the Caucasus region. On January 2nd of 1915, the War Council for the Allies came together and met in London. Now, excuse me, I'm going to list off the names here of the primary players from my notes, but bear with me, there's a lot to talk on. At this particular meeting, we had in attendance Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty. We had David Lloyd George, Chancellor of the Exchequer. Further, we had Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, and in attendance as well would be Field Marshal Horatio Herbert Kitchener, overall leader for British forces in the First World War. These men came together to discuss the possibility of supporting the Russians and opening up a second front. And over the course of several days, they finally came to an agreed upon plan. Relatively agreed upon. There's some controversy here, but we'll move ahead. All these men at the British War Council came to believe that an entirely naval operation could be possible, that they would simply take the great might of their allied naval forces, storm the Dardanelles through the Mediterranean, and then, with their boats, blast away Turkish resistance and take the city of Constantinople. On paper, this is a very bold and noble idea. Its practicality, however, fell apart, because as soon as naval operations began in February of 1915, well, things didn't go very well. It soon became very apparent that the Dardanelles were extremely well protected, and the Allied military and navy were unable to break that resistance. In particular, on March 18th of 1915, the Allies and their efforts with the Navy had come to a complete and dead standstill. This only led to one possibility for taking the Dardanelles and opening up a gateway into Constantinople, and that would be a land invasion. Some of you might laugh and think it's absolutely crazy that the Allies would consider a solely naval operation to capture the country of Turkey. However, there's actually reason to believe that this would have been a fairly well thought out strategy at the time. The main reason behind this being that Turkey had an absolutely terrible record of military losses and political instability. In 1914, the Young Turks were just in power and very new to that power. Further, by 1915, the likes of the Armenian genocide would kick off, which had made the country incredibly unstable. Adding to this as well were the fact that the soldiers of Turkey were incredibly undertrained, underfed, and frankly appeared to be extremely demoralized. So many factors seemed to be working in the Allies' favor for an easy victory. And unfortunately for the Allies, they were rather wrong. With the major defeat of the entirely naval force happening on March 18th of 1915, the Allies took over 5 weeks to get an invasion force together and begin the planning for this. For the Allies, in many ways, that time of 5 weeks was an absolutely terrible decision because it gave the Turks 2 major advantages. The first advantage is that it gave the Turks an incredibly moralizing victory. After so many losses over the current year, the fact that they had beaten back the Allies and that they completely ceased all naval operations in the area really boosted their spirit, and they realized for the first time that they had won. 2, with it now taking so long, intelligence forces of German and Turkish forces seemed to realize that the high likelihood of an invasion was coming. So, for the course of 5 weeks, the Dardanelles could be reinforced and new troops could be sent in, and further operations for intelligence could now go underway. That did not bode well for the Allies in their invasion at all. Over the course of those 5 weeks, and to be frank, bit of time before, the possibility and thoughts of finding the actual Allied invasion force proved to be exceptionally difficult because no one on the Western Front wanted to give up any experienced soldiers to go and partake in what seemed like some kind of secondary theater and a silly little sideshow that would take place against the Ottoman Empire and what seemed almost like a hopelessly ridiculous invasion force. Still, the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force was going to be created, and Kitchener got the overall say in the very end of who would be going. Let me quickly list off to you the 75,000 men that would be sent over in the first month alone. For starters, the Australian New Zealand Army Corps, or the ANZACs, would be contributing some 30,000 soldiers to the cause of the invasion, and for them it was going to be a baptism by fire. Further, the British were able to give loose the 29th Division, which had been staying on the home front, and were now fully ready and prepared for invasion. The 29th Division consisted of some 17,000 men. Further, the French would be giving 16,000 men to the cause, which, when we combine this all together, is quite an incredible force. All on top of this, we also have support from the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy Division would be contributing some 10,000 men to the invasion force, including their own Marines, which really was an amazing sight to behold. Supporting the Allied efforts would be 1.6 thousand animals being sent over, largely being donkeys, mules, ponies, and horses. With 75,000 men now fully prepared for the Allied invasion, their numerical superiority soon became apparent, because these 75,000 men were going up against a measly 50,000 Turks, who, again to the Allies, largely seemed to be malnourished, poorly trained, and deeply demoralized. In today's essay, as you know, we're going to be talking about the ANZACs, or the Australian New Zealand Army Corps. This again would be their baptism by fire, as they were an entirely brand new group. Now, let's transition and discuss exactly who these men were, where they were from, and what they were like as people. For the Australians and the New Zealanders, they didn't have an incredible history to pull back to as far as military record would be concerned. And in many ways, they had largely been viewed as a dominion force, or a colony force. They were not fully viewed as proper British subjects. And for them, this invasion was now the opportunity to show their own independence and military might, and set a precedence for future generations. They hoped that this invasion would reflect positively on them and prove that they were worthy subjects of the crown, as well as their own distinct forms of a national people. I'm going to very quickly now read you a simple excerpt from page 106 of Alan Moorhead's book Gallipoli. I personally believe that this excellently describes who the Australians and New Zealanders were at the time of 1915. The New Zealanders and the Australians were an unknown quantity. They were all volunteers. They were paid more money than any other soldiers, and they exhibited a spirit which was quite unlike anything which had been seen on a European battlefield before, unlike their forefathers. They had grown 6 inches in height. Their faces were thin and leathery, their limbs immensely lithe and strong. Their voices, too, had developed a harsh Cockney accent of their own, and their command of the more elementary oaths and blasphemies, even judged by the most liberal army standards, were appalling. Such military forms as the salute did not come very easily to these men. This independent spirit was a promising thing in its own way. Something like that, personally, makes me feel very proud of my forefathers and fellow brethren. Until it was time to fully deploy, the ANZACs had been training and largely housed within the Greater Egypt area, in particular by the Great Pyramid of Giza, which is a hell of a cool place to be stationed by, though it is admittedly quite hot. Knowing that they were going to soon embark upon the great crusade and adventure of a lifetime, people started to develop within the Allied lines something referred to as Gallipoli fever. This was something certainly only young people of that time probably could have properly developed. They didn't know the danger that they were going into, but they were excited because this was now considered the great conquest of Constantinople. They thought of themselves almost as crusaders, or something of the Homeric Odyssey type. Command of Allied forces also really liked the idea of this Gallipoli fever, and they fully played into it and encouraged it among their troops. Certainly it had a moralizing effect, but it did not prepare them for what was to come. Allow me to read you a few quick quotations here of exactly how troops felt at that time, and it'll give you a much better understanding of what that Gallipoli fever really was. Our first quote here comes from the ever so eloquent Rupert Brooke of the Royal Navy Division. It's too wonderful for belief. I had not imagined fate could be so kind. Will Harrow's tower crumble under the 15-inch guns? Will the sea be polyphloisbic and wine-dark and unvintangible? Shall I loot mosaics from St. Sophia and Turkish delight in carpets? Should we be a turning point in history? Oh, so pervasively happy. Like a stream flowing entirely to one end, I suddenly realized that the ambition of my life has been, since I was 2, to go on a military expedition against Constantinople. Indeed, it almost sounds Homeric in its nature, and you can see that his Greek studies had paid off. Though I'll tell you right now, there's not a happy ending for Rupert Brooke. He would die during the invasion. Now, a quote here from Corporal Mostyn Price Jones of New Zealand's Canterbury Battalion. This letter was dated April 16th of 1915 and was going home to his mother. British, French, Australians, and New Zealand troops, all eager for the fray. Hundreds of cruisers, dreadnoughts, submarines, torpedo destroyers, and torpedo boats, all making a wonderful picture. It makes you realize the great might and strength of our empire. And you can even feel a thrill of pride run through you as you realize that you yourself are a part of this vast and magnificent brotherhood of people. These words from our forefathers are incredible and give beautiful insight into exactly what they were feeling and what they were experiencing before the invasion day. At this juncture, let's quickly go downstairs to our bunker where we can better discuss exactly what the invasion day kit would look like for Allied forces, in particular for the ANZACs at the April 25th invasion date. And here we are, ladies and gentlemen, downstairs now in our top secret Eager Beaver experimental bunker dash changing room. We aren't going to waste much time at all. We're going to talk real briefly about the landing force of the ANZACs on April 25th of 1915. More specifically, the kit that they wore and the kit that we'll be utilizing for the next few days as we live their lifestyle and talk about their experiences during the Gallipoli Campaign. Let's not waste any more time. I'm not going to waffle on. Let's get right into the subject here. When it came to the landing, they were wearing a very classical style and setup. It was going to be full wool near all the way. For starters, the undershirt here was a relatively classical laborer's shirt here, dyed in either white or in gray. We see a few different types out there, but for the most part, they were supposed to be issued with a gray undershirt. Again, full wool with metal buttons on it, and it wouldn't have had a proper standing collar. Instead, it's the older laborer's type of shirt where you would have been able to attach a collar here at the top. Though for combat purposes, it wasn't really viewed as necessary to go out and actually have a collar, so they didn't have it. When it came to the actual battle dress uniform, again, full wool. Here, in all of its glory, is what the AIF, or the Australian Imperial Force, would have been wearing. It has some really lovely pockets on here, great for storage. You have your epaulets as well. It's an incredibly thick wool. We also have here a nice little service belt with a brass ring up at the top just to cinch at the waist. Further down at the bottom, we have even more pockets, so actually having space to utilize these is really fantastic. The big problem with this, though, is again, it's made out of wool, entirely 100%. There are no synthetics. The reason this was done, of course, was better insulation, protection, and because wool was considered an extremely tough item at that time. Further, for Commonwealth and Dominion forces of the era, this would have been the standard uniform. However, the color was a bit different. Unlike khaki, this is more of a olive green, though not truly the olive drab that we're used to coming out in the 1940s. Still, actually a really, really nice setup. And to be fair, the jacket itself is really beautiful. Paired up with that jacket here, we have classic breeches. Now, this is a cavalry setup, but what the infantry wore in and of themselves was not too different. We have simple laces at the bottom to cinch there at the lower leg. Further, you'd either be running a putty or a higher boot or leather gaiters up over these depending on your branch of service. And of course, since it was the athletic taper of the time, here around the calf, you'll notice that it gets much, much wider, right about yay, and that was rather to be like sweatpants. When you wore and utilized these, it gave you a bit more breathing room and stretch. That being said, their practicality was always a bit debatable. You would also be wearing these, as you can see from the front and the back here. With these, you would have been wearing your combat suspenders. Now, it might seem silly, but again, in 1914 and 15, this was considered extremely athletic, and we're very happy to be having these with us. But we do want to make a note right now. We'll actually be substituting these out, because when it comes to representing Gallipoli, we're going to be making a few field alterations not too long in the near future. So these will be spared what's coming up, but everything else we'll be wearing here in the kit. When it came to the likes of footwear, pretty much everyone was going to be wearing this. You've seen us in these before, but these are the British ammo boot, which saw roughly 50 years of service for the Crown, starting production in the early 1900s and going all the way into the 1950s. In this case, we have a toe and a heel made of metal, followed by which we have a flat bottom, or we can also have these hobnailed. In this case, this is the flat variant. And then we have cover on the toe here of leather, and shoelaces made of leather. It's really not a terrible boot by any means, but frankly, you'll find that it comes up a bit short. But these were ubiquitous for Commonwealth forces abroad and at home. Since these boots happen to be particularly short, however, there were two variants of legging or gaiter that could be utilized. If you were a foot soldier, you'd be wearing the ever so classic putty. These are simply wool wraps that start right here, just right at the very top of the boot, and go roughly up to the calf or the knee, depending on your needs. Further, if you weren't going to be just in standard infantry and were something like cavalry or the ever so famed Australian light horse, you'd be issued these. This here is the original pair of cavalry leggings. Now, these actually came from Australia, but when we look at the make, it's highly likely that these are actually an American type that were brought over to Australia post-war. Still, we won't be wearing these, but we're happy to show them for the sake of display. Quick note though, for anyone who loves this cavalry legging, once you went to Gallipoli, you found out that these weren't very useful off a horse, and plenty of guys either completely got rid of their leggings, or they transitioned here to the wool puttees because they still offered a bit of support and protection, but were lighter, cooler, and frankly felt better on the leg. It would be extremely remiss if we didn't talk about the slouch hat here. This has become an icon of Australian culture and military service. Now, this production here is from the 2000s, however, it's really not very far off from what they would have utilized during the First World War. A few key differences that you'll see here is that, for starters, the band here is wrong. First of all, you wouldn't be using a belt like this. This is something that we personally do to differentiate us. But it also wouldn't have had the ever so popular puggery, which we see after World War I. During World War I, what they would have had instead was a simple wool band that wrapped around this hat, which helped denote who you were serving with, as well as to give it a bit of simple style. Though, in the service, plenty of those bands completely fell apart and came off or were removed. They just weren't very comfortable or useful. Further, when it came to the like of actually putting the slouch on, as cool as it is, most service members actually would have opened it up and dropped it over. That way the larger brim here would have been covering you and protecting you. Though, for anyone who's concerned about helmet safety, well, you're out of luck. This was the only headwear they would have been issued during the Gallipoli Campaign, and pretty much the only one that the ANZACs, in particular the Australians, would be wearing and utilizing. Before you here, we have two different forms of ammunition belt. Both of these, however, are designed to carry .303 British ammunition, which was the common round for both world wars at that time for Commonwealth forces. This one here is the ever so more common 5-pocket setup system, and it's very nice. You simply take this, sling it over your shoulder, and then you have 5 pouches to grab ammunition from across the chest. They also had a 9-pocket version, which could be worn across the chest or on your own waist, which wasn't bad. That being said, these were generally only issued to the likes of the cavalry or for anyone involved in a special operation, so to speak, such as our friends in the Navy. All of that said, plenty of men did get their hands on these and utilize these because they found them much lighter and more useful than the likes of the pattern 1908 ammunition setup and overall web gear that they had. Further, it just looked cool. That being said, these were not always available, so a leftover from the Boer War came up, which is this setup here. It's actually quite nice. It's simply a basic bandolier with a cover system here. You'll pop the tabs and then you can store your bullets here. It's far more open and exposed, but that being said, on the individual bullet count, you carry a great deal more. You'd also see these worn on the hip with a minor slouch to it, and then cinched up here with this basic hook, if you can spot it, onto the waistband. Otherwise, it'd go over the shoulder again and across the chest. Both of these saw their time, especially when it came to the Sinai and Palestine campaigns after Gallipoli, but they did see action in Gallipoli as well. We'll be taking these into the field to show you how they're used, but for the most part, they'll just be looking pretty until then. This absolute behemoth here is the pattern 1908 web gear system. This was ubiquitous and extremely common for all infantry forces across the Commonwealth. Although it was first adopted by mainland Britain, it very quickly saw its way into production in the likes of South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia, with their own native productions being set up, otherwise being exported to them very quickly. We're going to do a brief overview of this, and if there's a need in the future, we'll take greater detail. For starters, right here on the side here, this here is the haversack, or a musette bag if you prefer to call it that. It was also called the little bag. You just carry it simply by the waist here. We generally utilize this here for carrying our smaller items and our day's rations. Coming up here, its cousin is the big bag, more properly known as the valise. This is a heavy setup, and it does weigh rather strongly on the shoulders, but still, it's very welcome because it carries weight so very well for its time. You also see we have our sleeping system here, the blanket, which we'll pull out later to discuss exactly how we'll be sleeping, but it's put up here for carrying at this moment. Moving down over here, we have our water carrying system with a cork top. Further, we have our e-tool or spade hidden beneath it here. And we also have on both sides 5 different pouches for .303 British ammunition. It's actually a pretty nice setup in that regard because it's quickly accessible. You simply pop these brass tabs, you pull up, you grab the rounds you need, and you pack them into your rifle. It was a very smart design at the time, though we admit it's extremely busy. Give us a moment now, we'll give you a quick close-up so you have a better look at what this really looks like. Because trust us, it's heavy.
The 1908 system was really excellent for the fact that it could carry modern ammunition and modern weights. The inclusion of the likes of the haversack, valise, the canteen, e-tool, and ammo pouches made it extremely useful in the field.
From here, let's have the opportunity to discuss the rations of Gallipoli for Australian and New Zealand forces. Right here, we have all the canned goods we could ever possibly want, including canned salmon,
the ever so common and beloved corned beef or bullied beef, hardtack, canned and tinned. Further, we even have the ever so luxurious item of the sardine can right here. Not so bad. All of these items were relatively heavy, but they were well preserved, and they could keep a man alive. The biggest issue for Gallipoli was not always the fact that rations were not going to be available through the transport line, it's getting them to the furthest front line. Many soldiers would go hungry because getting up the mountains was an extremely difficult process, especially when you keep in mind that enemy fire and elevated positions were constantly looking down on you. Still, when you could get to eat these, it wasn't so bad. Though, funny note, when it came to the bullied beef here, or corned beef, Turkish soldiers didn't like it. Even when they raided trenches for food, they would leave these behind. Maybe that tells you something of the strange taste or the incredible fighting spirit of the ANZAC. And here we have the standard firearm for infantrymen across all the Commonwealth and Great Britain. This here is the Mark III rifle. More specific, it's the Enfield. This is a really beautiful recreation. To the keen-eyed, you'll notice it's not the real deal. It's another airsoft gun by the S&T company. However, this is really a beautiful and faithful recreation. Even the markings on here are really nice. The safety is right here to the rear. Simply click it on or click it off forward. The bolt in total is right here. Fairly open, still usable. We have our sight, fully adjustable for the necessary yardage that we need. And over here we have the flat snub nose, which was very typical of the Mark III. The bayonet mount being here for a 10 to 20 inch bayonet roughly, depending on how you wanted to fight and what your parade ground really looked like. Still, beautiful rifle, and we're happy to take it into the field because something like airsoft allows us to give all of you a better view at what it would be like to have a live fire situation. We'll use this in simulations fairly soon, but for now, take a closer look at this and just enjoy it for the beautiful art piece that we have before us. And here is the final get-up, ladies and gentlemen. This is what your Australians, and to a lesser degree your ANZACs, would have largely looked like when they would have landed on April 25th of 1915. We have our rifle in hand, we have our webbing all set up, and we even feel cocky enough to put the bill up here and slouch our hat, which isn't so bad. Now, I'm going to do a quick turnaround walkabout so you can fully see what this equipment looks like, and so we can put a few key notes out there and you can get a better idea of what the total kit is. For the landings that were supposed to occur on the morning of April 25th, 1915, the ANZACs were given the ever so cleverly named ANZAC Beach. Later on, this landing site would become known as ANZAC Cove. However, when they were landing, what they expected to find was a vast open range and a field where they could more easily set up and assemble their troops, and from there, make the push inland to cut off the peninsula and better support their own men. However, what turned out to happen was that the rowboats were going to be pushed off course by roughly a mile, and they would wind up north of an area more easily known as Tunic Bear and the Seri Bear Ridge. This was not good, because instead of having the large opening that they were hoping for assembly, they came directly into mountain and cliffside faces. That being said, there was a minor advantage to this, because the enemy hadn't put that many defenders there, because the idea of attacking it was already suicidal. For the troops that left, it was roughly going to be 30 men or more to a rowboat, and they were going to be pulled from their ships all the way up to roughly a 30-yard point where they would be released from steamboats and make the final row towards shore. Now, there was no initial fighting. The boats were let off and loaded by 4 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't until 4:30 a.m. that the first shots started to ring out against the ANZACs when they were only 50 yards away from the shore. They quickly disembarked and made a break for it. Many men drowned, but at the same time plenty made it to shore. And it was here that when they wound up, they began to make their name known. And this is also why
April 25th is known as ANZAC Day. The initial charge up to take the overall ground surrounding ANZAC Bay was actually a success. Allow me very quickly to read you a quote of just exactly what that battle was like. The lads cheered every inch of the way, which I really believe helped to dishearten the Turks, for when we got near the top, they jumped out of their trenches and ran like old Harry to their second line of trenches, a distance of half a mile or so. Although these landings may have appeared to be successful, they weren't without their difficulties. So now, allow us to transition out of this, and let's discuss exactly what those landings were like with the simulation we have set up for your viewing. Come along with me.
Here we are now with our version of ANZAC Beach. Although it's not a perfect fit for the Dardanelles, it still is water, and it will serve the purpose of helping us discuss the difficulties of an amphibious landing.
And here we are at our makeshift ANZAC beach. Now, we fully admit that out here it's just a neighborhood pond, but for our purposes it should do fine for our beach landing activity, because what we're here to talk about is the fact that an actual naval landing, an amphibious assault, is a very difficult process to do, especially for World War I. Keep in mind, when the ANZACs landed, their boats were 30 men per boat, and they were just standard rowboats, so they were fully open and exposed. The Turks were at the high ground shooting down at them. But in this case, we just have two men here. You have myself, and then you have Blake, as you can see here. Doesn't he look so good in that nice Akubra there? Very sporting. Anyhow, what we have to do is simply go from 30 yards all the way up here to the beachhead and land, and receive as few shots as possible from our heavy. Our heavy today is being Adam. Adam is going to be strapped with 40 plus rounds for his airsoft rifle, shooting at us constantly until we finally step foot on dry ground. From there, the man with the least shots received is the winner. And keep in mind, we're going to be using these boats with a 30 shot limit, so if Adam hits one of us 30 times, the entire boat is wiped out. We'll compare the scores here of the hits to the 30, and Adam will be going for it. Now, if you excuse me, we're going to be taking off before the sun goes down, and the ANZACs would have been landing in the morning, so this darkness works for us. Let's get started.
Before you here are the boats that Blake and I will be utilizing for our assault demonstration. Both of these are Eagle Talon 12s. Keep in mind, these are much nicer than what the ANZACs had to land in. As you can see here, what they used were simple wooden rowboats, which, frankly, functioned more like lifeboats than proper landing craft of a military use. Further, they provide little if any protection to those inside. Edom here is portraying a Turkish sharpshooter and will be our heavy.
It's time to defend the homeland from these ANZACs.
We appreciate Edom's enthusiasm to protect the homeland.
Right.
Now, with very little hesitation, we take our kayaks out into the water, and from there we're going to row out 30 yards to get to our starting position so that we can properly begin the demonstration of an amphibious assault. If you expected this little kayaking trip to be peaceful, I must warn you now, you are entirely wrong.
Just a lonely Turk. What? Oh my, I think those are ANZACs. Time to take them down.
For anyone who's ever been curious, I can tell you now, getting shot at with a BB gun while kayaking is not actually very fun. Also, if you want to know when Blake and I get shot, just take a look at the hit counter in the bottom left-hand corner, though frankly, you should also hear us react to it fairly easily. And it was at this point here that I got shot in the face and then fell off of my boat. Now, swimming in wool and with the webbing equipment was already difficult, but imagine now if you were at Gallipoli with real bullets and carrying over 100 pounds. That would be an absolutely horrific experience. Fortunately, I did make it ashore, and taking inspiration from the ANZACs, I immediately went into a melee.
Here we go. Can you
Blake, hold it right there for a second, and then we'll get you coming up.
Now that was tough. I didn't even make it out of the boat onto dry land yet. Come on. I made it.
So, boys and girls, it might have looked silly, but as a demonstration goes, an amphibious landing is absolutely no joke. While coming up, I believe Adam shot me fairly 5 times, so that's just 5 casualties there. In the course of probably he didn't start shooting until we were about 15 yards away. So, that's something else. And then keep in mind, when they went out there, they had over 100 pounds of equipment with rifles, and they're wearing full wool uniforms. When I flipped over when he shot me in the face, I was gonna say, you can feel it pulling you down, and I was so fortunate that my feet could be close to the ground. But even then, you can feel it pulling you into the mud. So imagine what they went through. And the fact of the matter is, the beach landing for them went terribly wrong. Come with me.
Quickly reviewing the final score for the Amphibious Assault Challenge, Blake was hit 3 times and I was hit 5 times. Therefore, Blake is our official winner. And his grand prize is the opportunity to utilize the shower first. Now, let us go back into the field to conclude our thoughts.
As you can plainly see, we've gotten quite wet. Yes?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
We really did our best not to hold back on this one for you. We would have loved to have more people out here with rifles and with boats, but that's not really possible in the neighborhood, yeah?
Right.
So I think that's fairly good. But Blake is a veteran on staff. He'll tote that all the time. And I'm just a friendly neighborhood historian. But I can tell you now, from my experience out there, doing a boat landing at 4 o'clock in the morning when the sun's not even up, having only had, a cup of coffee, and then getting shot at from an elevated position in open and exposed boats would have been horrific. I mean, again, when I was in the water, I could just feel it pulling me down. And on top of this, we're fully exposed. There's nowhere to hide. How do you feel about it, Blake?
Absolutely. Like trying to reach the beachhead is almost impossible this way. And then, not to mention, if you fall in the water, all of your equipment is waterlogged. So your boots, your clothing. So when you do reach land, now you have to fight in waterlogged gear. So I mean, it's not fun, no matter any way you look at it at all.
No, it's not. And the fact that they were able to take those mountains overhead at Area Bernu is impressive. They did it at the point of a bayonet.
It's just crazy to think that those guys went through that.
Yeah.
So.
And then they got to stay there for 9 months. I suppose we'll have to wrap it up there for now and dry off, but this has been a very eye-opening experience. Just like a frontal assault, you only have one way, and that's forward. So really what they did was absolutely harrowing. Absolutely. Well, boys and girls, let's transition over to our next piece now. When there's more sunshine and drying off, hopefully, we can talk to you a little better.
Now, let's transition back to the dry land and talk about what it was like to live as an ANZAC once the landing had occurred.
Needless to say, based off of that previous exercise, the landings at ANZAC Beach and Cove did not go well at all. And by the time that the sun was going down, most troops had started making their way back to the beach because they had lost their units, had lost most of their supplies, and they had no idea what the strategic goals were at that point because they had landed completely off target. So, for the people in charge, the call was being made that they should evacuate the beach at that point. However, from the man at the tippy top most, the general in charge, he had a comment like this to say.
You have got through the difficult business. Now you have only to dig, dig, dig until you are safe. General Sir Ian Hamilton.
As you can judge by that, the choice was that they were going to stay, and therefore they took out their entrenching tools and began to dig into the earth. All around you, Gallipoli started to look like a massive strip mine, and they'd work in the late hours of the night into the early hours of the morning, digging themselves in to be better defended. So, Let's cut over to our next activity now, which is digging a hole into the earth, which will be super fun. Come along. In this particular moment, a great bit of New Zealand and at the same time Australian history comes into play. Because as the Australians and New Zealanders are digging into their positions, they start to name themselves the Diggers. And this popular term has stayed. To this very day, anyone associated with the Australians and the New Zealanders as a soldier is known as a digger. It's a nickname that has stuck around for a long time, and because of the entrenchments that were going to take place at Gallipoli, that name comes into play there, and it has stayed with them ever since. Now, with the fun fact out of the way, let's get into the fun 8 hours now of digging into an entrenchment.
16,000 ANZACs were involved in the process of digging the protective perimeter around the bay. That day alone, 2,000 casualties had been amassed, and protection was needed.
As you see me digging the hole back there, you're probably thinking, is it smart to be wearing an all-wool uniform to dig a hole? No, of course not. Which is why we're going to change it up here real quick. For starters, I'm going to be taking this jacket off because all wool is really, really, really hot. Further, the hat here is no longer going to be slouching. We're going to open it up. Now, this here is what I would call far more comfortable. Let's open it up here and breathe a bit. And now, let's go spend the other 7 hours of our day digging this hole.
Many former civilian miners were put to work on these projects to dig the most extensive lines. However, every ANZAC had a part in digging their own entrenchment. Now, the environment that we're working in is not perfect. However, the soil here really does speak to the ANZAC experience at Gallipoli. It's a mix of sand, red clay, and then hard earthened rock. The only difference is that once they arrived at the Dardanelles, there were very few trees in the area, mostly due to heavy bombardment. Still, this is the dirt that we get to sleep in for the next 3 days. The severely rugged environment of ANZAC Cove led to a wide variety of trenches and styles, and the trenches that were built would never really be quite on par with those of the Western Front in Europe. The process of digging certainly also makes one thirsty. However, keep in mind that most ANZACs only had 1 liter on hand throughout the entire day. We have the great fortune, however, of digging while not being shot at, and we're also filming while it's light out. The ANZACs were still being sniped at, artillery was still coming down in many areas, and adding to the tumult is the fact that many of them were also still wounded, and not with their proper units. Certainly what they went through was a harrowing experience. So this little bit of work, we're just fine and dandy to keep doing.
Now, as I promised, we're going to start digging out the trench a little bit, and we have a secret tool in our arsenal when it comes to expanding our defilade. Let me show you. All right. This right here is leftover wood, and it's going to go to the front of our trench to increase the defilade. This is something that plenty of people used on the Western Front and in the likes of Gallipoli to reinforce what they already had. This will help up that dirt barrier a little bit and give us something else to get behind and have a bit of cover. So let me throw this in the trench and we'll get started.
Now, for the ANZACs on the beach, what they had was not going to be just used walking way wood. They were taking pieces of old crates as well as pieces of houses, fishermen's shack, and anything that would wash up on the shore to reinforce their trenches. This would help to protect them, keep dirt in place, and give their heads just a little extra room for cover. We'll also utilize the butt of our rifle here to drive down spikes to keep a lot of our boards in place. This also helps in the process of backfilling these boards. We can't have empty air pockets in between them. We have to have the space of that dirt filled in. And again, my job is easy because I can do this while outside the trench. Could you imagine doing this outside of the trench while being shot at? That's a rather harrowing experience. You might think that sounds far-fetched or crazy, but trench maintenance was a daily task, especially with the constant fighting in the areas. If we are also so fortunate, we're going to take dirt and throw it to the front of our protected trenches here, just to soften any blows coming towards us.
We are finally nearly done with digging our trench, which is pretty nice. It's looking fairly sturdy at this point. However, we do have one final touch which will really make it feel like home, and also it will speak to the Gallipoli experience just a touch more. Let me show it to you.
Before you here are 2 pieces of scrap wood and used nails. We're going to use these as our canvas, so to speak. We are very simply going to utilize a hammer to drive these 2 boards together using the old nails. Now comes the fun part of using this chalk to draw on this particular canvas. I'm certain you guessed by now that we're making a sign, so we're going to drive it into the dirt right over our heads here. And finally, we have a sign pointing to home. And no, that is not the male reproductive organ. That is supposed to be a human hand. Please get your mind out of the gutters there, ladies and gentlemen. And with that, we now have a home sweet home kind of moment. Here is the frontal view of our miniature Gallipoli trench. And here is what our entrenchment looks like from the inside. And this is what I get to sleep in for 3 days straight. That being said, we would have liked to have dug it deeper, however, the water table here starts at 3 feet.
And here we are, ladies and gentlemen. At the near very end of our day, we have been able to successfully dig ourselves in roughly 3 feet deep before we hit the water table, and now we're here in our Gallipoli trench, where I'll be for the next 3 days, living it out. For the first day of the assault, things certainly hadn't gone well, but the Australians proved themselves to certainly be a hardy group of people, and formidable fighters, and they were able to hold up and last the night. That being said, you're probably wondering, what did they eat for dinner on the first night? They ate pretty much nothing. They weren't able to get supplies in, and they weren't able to be fully supported. Further, their water ration was growing dangerously low. Most men hadn't eaten anything since they deployed, which had only been a breakfast of a single roll and some hot coffee, and that was before 4 o'clock in the morning. Those who had made it and survived hadn't really had anything else to eat except maybe a fair day's ration if they snuck it in. Plenty had much less than that. And again, most were only issued with 1 can of water. So in order to keep it real, I won't be eating tonight. I'll simply enjoy my water and hopefully be able to cleanly refill that in the morning.
With the sun setting just over the hill behind us, it is now time to transition to bedtime.
We're pretty much done for the day, but you might be asking, what is my amazing sleeping system? This beauty right here. I'm going to be sleeping under this comfortable wool blanket, and my bed, of course, will be dirt. It really isn't as bad as you think because no one's shooting at me tonight, and frankly, the weather's pretty comfortable right now. I'm going to go ahead and curl up and I'll show you what sleeping in this trench looks like, and then I'm actually going to go to sleep, and I'll get with you sometime in the early morning, hopefully.
For the first few days of the Gallipoli campaign, sleeping looked a lot like this, where soldiers would be near fully exposed. However, in time, they would expand their trenches and be a bit better covered. But it didn't improve the life that much. You might think that the night brings peace and quiet, but that's completely wrong. As you can see overhead, nighttime just brings a free fire show.
Now, here's a fun fact for all of you today. While at Gallipoli, soldiers on average really only got roughly 2 hours to 4 hours worth of sleep because the shooting and barrages were constant. So, let's enjoy this moment, shall we? Yeah, I'm not sleeping tonight. As so many of you can see, for all of your viewing pleasure, I got shot in the mouth while doing that bit. But hey, that's cool, because in this wet hole, I'll be sleeping now for the next maybe 2 or 4 hours, and then we'll just be enjoying the night together. Isn't this so much fun? Honestly, we're living the Gallipoli experience. Good night.
And certainly, a little burn is nothing compared to what the ANZACs underwent at Gallipoli. And, eventually, I did get to go to sleep. From the safe inside of our trench, here is what the morning world looks like, as it has fully been illuminated by the sun overhead.
Well, hello there, boys and girls. I've had a fairly comfortable night. I actually got warm enough I could throw off the blanket, but I have to admit, I'm grateful I took the advice of the people who live here, because the water table, if I kept digging, would have only gotten worse. The ground I've slept on is relatively wet, and you can see right there that I'm certainly getting a bit muddy, but that's okay. We're living it out pretty well. I have come to an incredible realization while being out here, and that is that wearing long woolen pants really sucks. Further, when you pair that with the puttees, well, you just never really dry off easily, you sweat constantly, and it's uncomfortable. As you can see down there, I've left my puttees and socks to dry off, and then my shoes are down by my feet. The wool pants that I'm wearing just have to go. And fortunately, our forefathers at Gallipoli had an excellent solution now for getting comfortable in the heat and the sun very quickly. Let me show it to you.
For starters, we're going to need our bayonet. And then we get to start the fun alteration of cutting off our pant legs. And very quickly, just like the ANZACs at Gallipoli here, we have a homemade pair of shorts for the outdoors. And it does feel great to get some of that air flowing. Although we have shorts made, we still have to finish the outfit off. We're gonna brush our feet off now with the rags of our former pant and then put on shoes, after which we throw on our puttees to protect and support our lower legs. And here is the final example of what the Gallipoli shorts would have looked like for the ANZACs at ANZAC Cove in 1915. It might not be the most summer stylish, but it's useful. With an outfit like this, we don't pretend or claim we're gonna win Fashion Week, but I can tell you right now that for World War I, this has gotten extremely far more comfortable. We've rolled up our sleeves, we've completely cut away our long breeches here, and now we can just let our legs breathe. We're really opening up all of these wool layers. Simply taking that bayonet, as we see here, and cutting off these legs into something like basic used rags, really make my life a lot better. Really, you couldn't ask for more comfort back in 1915, and this is what a lot of the men did. You'll see a variety of pictures of how they looked, but it was all about getting comfortable in what was becoming an extremely hot, arid, and miserable environment. They wouldn't even wear the puttees very often, though we see them used on occasion just to strengthen and protect the legs, as it functions as a taller boot. That being said, plenty of them were just completely gotten rid of, and men would simply strip down all the way to the waist, just wearing their shorts, nothing up top, and then basic pair of shoes. They wouldn't even wear their socks because they were so destroyed and ruined. Now, we have a quick change of subject here because now it's time to talk about what we're having for breakfast. So, come along with me as we address this next emergency. Very quickly for the Allies, especially the ANZACs at Gallipoli, a crisis had developed around the subject of drinking water. They were only issued 1 liter a day, which was extremely severe considering how hot it was. Further, having potable or drinkable water was extremely rare to come by. For most men, they would have to wait to be issued it, and it would have to come from islands in Greece all the way over then to Gallipoli, where then from Anzac Beach it could be walked up individually by teams to the very front lines. It was a huge issue to get water. And even when they did finally have the likes of desalination and cleansing processes for the water in the area, some men claimed that it killed their friends and wouldn't drink it. Adding to this conundrum was the fact that water also had to be transported up in any way it could. Used kerosene and petrol containers were utilized, and even when they were solidly cleaned, the taste was still there, and men claimed that it made them sick. This here was a major crisis. That being said, we'll show you a simple way of drinking water in the modern day and age that would have helped them immensely, and it'll give us a touch of realism here for being in the field. For starters, getting water was a dangerous task.
They couldn't just simply walk to the beachhead. It was constantly being sniped and barraged by artillery. Men would have to sneak, run, and crawl their way to the front and constantly duck their heads, especially in the more exposed side flanks, because the trenches there were not particularly deep. So excuse me now as I continue to crawl my way towards the water source. Here by the water, we can fill up our bottle. Now, I don't pretend that this pales in comparison to the absolute scale that was ANZAC Beach. ANZAC Beach would have been absolutely packed. It would have been filled with hundreds of men, hundreds of thousands of crates, munitions, food supplies, and not to even mention the hospitals and the animals, and the constant stream of ships coming in and out, then paired with a near constant barrage from enemy artillery. That being said, this still gives us a little more of a hardy example of what it's like to get water in the field. In this case, let's start up by sticking this in the water, and I promise you, it's not perfectly clean by any means.
So let us fill up our bottle here first.
Now, this water here is not a perfect example of beach water. It's a lot more close to jungle water, but I can still promise you there's plenty of delicious sandy floaters in there, which will be fun. That being said, we don't have a desalination facility here, but we do have the next best thing. For our purposes today, we're going to be using some basic water cleaning tablets, which should still give us a delicious iodine flavor and taste, and clean up all the floaters in here that we really don't want. We'll put in 2 tablets here, and then we'll talk all about this Gallipoli tasting water.
So we take our 2 tablets and we drop them into this liter of water here. Now we just have to wait 10 minutes and we have our drink fully ready and prepared.
And here we are now back in our trench with our delicious, hopefully potable water. Let me take a sip of this here and I will tell you all about its incredible flavor. Indeed, this tastes a hell of a lot like iodine. There are a few sandy floaters in there, but you know what? It's still drinkable water. I know I'll be fine because of this, and I ration myself to this 1 liter supply just because that's what the ANZACs went through during their time at Gallipoli. So this should be relatively fine. That being said, for them, this was a lifesaver, and frankly, I'm grateful to have it. Now that we have that other segment done with, you're probably wondering, what did the ANZACs do for fun? Well, there's all kinds of fun activities available to those on the front lines of Gallipoli. Let me list them off for you.
You can watch water drip into the earth and turn it into mud. You can watch worms crawl in that mud and look more happy than you. You can also take the opportunity to utilize a bayonet to pick the mud out of your boots.
You know, the more I think of it, almost none of those are particularly fun. But that's okay, because I do have one more game, mind you, a game of life and death, that they played, and you might just find interesting yourself.
Now, what is this here? Could this be a head popping above the trenches ever so carelessly? Or could it be a ghost with a hat on? Let's take a closer look here and see what's going on.
You're probably wondering what I'm doing over here, but I'm baiting the enemy right now with a little bit of clever puppeteering. So far, we don't have any shots, but still, I can talk to you just a little bit about some of the technique here that might help you in the field in the future, and certainly speaks to the experience of the ANZAC. Now, when it comes to baiting the enemy, there are all kinds of wonderful tips and tricks. Here's a relatively simple one. Now, this is only a 10-inch bayonet. They would have been using something more like a 16 up to even a 20. Some of those were insane. But you simply take this bayonet, put your hat in it or your helmet, you hold it over the parapet, and then with the helmet strap, you can steer the head like this or like this, and then kind of move it back and forth like someone is there. It's a bit more realistic, and surprisingly, it does work in the field. And this is one method of baiting the enemy that they used at Gallipoli. Mind you now, you're probably going to get a hole in your hat, so if you really beloved it, you might want to consider using someone else's hat. Still, it's not a bad trick. Some people might view that as a bit silly or classical, and I admit that for the camera we exaggerated in the movement a little bit. But still, when it came to Gallipoli, the ANZACs first learned from the likes of the Turks, who used camouflage and face paints and trickery like that, and soon picked up on it and got to work. However, there is another bit of history we like to share with you, and it almost sounds like something out of the Old West. However, we're going to demonstrate for you a very classical sniper duel, and that is our next activity. And believe it or not, it's based on fact. All right. Now, when it comes to the basics of the sniper duel, two men on opposite trenches would come out of their trenches, be fully armed and prepared at an organized and set time to take each other out. They would take turns, almost like the Old West, taking shots at each other, and may the best man win. If they were hopefully going to be polite, they'd only aim to injure you so you could be medically evacuated. And if they wanted to be far less polite, they'd aim to kill. In this case, on the Ottoman bank here, my good friend Edom is helping us out. Come on up, Edom. How are you today, Edom? Good?
Doing great.
He looks great. Now, this is not a perfect Ottoman outfit, but he does stick out, and that's the main thing for filming. Hold the rifle real quick, buddy, if you don't mind. We'll both be using the same rifle here. It's just an airsoft rifle. It's a Mark III Enfield. We've had plenty of time to practice, and that way, by using the same rifle, we know it's a fair game here. Some of you might think that this is an incredibly exaggerated account, but we've pulled it here from Alan Moorhead's book, Gallipoli. More specific, right here on page 180, it talks on this. Now, with that said, he's going to take his position roughly 40 yards away from me. I'm going to go this way, he's going to go that way, and we'll get ready to see who wins our little sniper duel here. May the best man win. Good luck, old boy.
You too.
Until then.
Now for my favorite part of the shoot. I get to shoot Anthony. Again.
You missed. In order to make sure I properly hit him dead, my hat bill is going to be secured up here so we know we line up the shot. Let's get started. That's not fair.
Now I can tell you right away, if that was a real bullet, I would be suffering right now. I just got shot in the abdominals, which means I gotta die slowly and painfully. But fortunately,
This is just a field exercise. And we played it relatively safe, I'm certain. That being said, that was the fate for many men at Gallipoli. Still, since we're all friends here, Adam gets the win in this case, as he hit me dead on in our sniper duel. We'll go shake on it real quick. Very good game, sir.
Good game to you as well.
Indeed. And it's quite true that there was actually a surprising amount of camaraderie between the ANZACs and who they would also know as Johnny Turk. For some odd reason, because they were in such close proximity, duels like that were viewed as very honorable, and the actions there somehow became surprisingly heartfelt. Again, very good game on his part and on mine. And now I get to go back to my trench. I'm really gonna not look forward to that.
Yeah, you enjoy that.
I will. Ladies and gentlemen. There's something here that happened in the middle of filming that I wanted to share with you. From one of our suppliers, we received this little gift. Now, I don't know if he really knew that we were doing this, but we appreciate it because a little medallion like this reminds you of what we're doing. In this instance, this is a commemoration for the Battle of the Neck, which occurred on August 7th of 1915, involving the 8th and 10th Light Horse Companies. In that attack, 600 men were involved, of which 372 of them would either be wounded or killed in action. It's largely known in Gallipoli as an incredibly futile event. However, it does remind us why we're out here. And just to bring it a little closer to home, part of this is done in memory to one of my great uncles. His name was Joseph William Goad. He was a member of the 4th Light Horse Brigade, and he signed up in 1914 at the age of just 19 years old. His first taste of action was at Gallipoli. So I hope with that in mind, some of you will remember him, and hopefully some of you will also remember the memories of your own forefathers and their own involvement in the Great Conflict. If you ever want to look him up, his service number was 410. Now from there, we have to get back to filming. But to our friends in the supplying group, thank you so much for sending this. It means a lot more to us and everyone on the team than you could possibly know. Thank you, and we wish you a very honored and celebratory ANZAC Day. Here we're now getting to the end of the day again, so let's talk about meal 2 for dinner. And that's a fun one. It's gonna be hardtack like this. This kind of food we had to make homemade, but back in the day, what they had here was essentially a piece of incredibly unleavened and unappetizing bread, cooked down for too long to make it last longer, and it could be so hard you'd break your teeth on it. It really was not an enjoyable meal. However, there's a fun little bit of food history here that we can talk on real quick. Just on occasion, the Turks would sneak over lines, and just outside the trenches, they'd drop little gifts, like this. Well, hello there. In here, we have a little bit of the Turkish rations that would be shared with the Allies. Let me open this up and I'll show it to you.
As intense as the fighting was at Gallipoli, for some reason, the ANZACs and the Turkish soldiers grew somewhat close and had a respecting rivalry, and gifts like these between both sides were often exchanged peacefully.
This is a really lovely gift. We have simple mixed nuts like almonds, which would have been plentiful over there and taste great. And even dried fruits here like this here cherry, as well as dates, which would have been the most common. Having anything like a fruit in the ANZAC diet was pretty much unheard of. The Allies simply couldn't provide it. And again, it was mostly hardtack and canned foods. So right now, I kind of feel like a king. Admittedly, this one kind of hurts my teeth. But bon appetit!
Let us now talk about some real and true ANZAC ingenuity, and touch on a subject here that might just be a bit explosive.
Well, we were hoping to have a nice talk, but they're currently shooting at us, and we have to retaliate for that. So what we're going to use here is a tin can and improvise our defense. Let's get started. For the large majority of the ANZACs who had been dropped at Gallipoli, they weren't issued with hand grenades, so very quickly they had to improvise. And it started off with one man thinking that a tin can packed with basic thermite could do the trick. They threw in the likes of rocks, excess shrapnel, and anything else they could get into these, packed it with as many explosives as they could, put a charge on top, and blew it away. Now, YouTube does not allow us to show how to make an explosive. However, we can use a small firework to demonstrate the basics of that. And for educational purposes, that's all we'll be doing, is making a dummy, not an actual explosive, to show you what those hand grenades at Gallipoli really look like. Let's start with the step-by-step instructions.
To begin, we need an empty tin can, and we need to be able to puncture a hole into the very top lid. The ANZACs also would have been collecting shrapnel pieces. Most of these would have been rocks or leftover pieces of wood and metal found about their trenches and strewn across the battlefield for the can. The ANZACs also had access to the likes of tannerite and gunpowder, which would go into these hand grenades to make them explode. However, in this case, we're just using 3 grams of very basic flash powder. With that thrown in, we're now going to insert our lightable fuse. These would have been the initial fuses utilized until pullable cord was possible for the jam tin bombs as they slowly improved. From here, we're now going to seal up the holes at the very top seal of our can, and most of this just involves playing with mud, which is an exciting bit of fun here. Here is what a jam tin grenade would have looked like during the first few days of Gallipoli. It might look ridiculous, but they were extremely effective at the time. Here is what 3 grams of flash powder can do inside of a can. It might seem kind of silly, but the fact that just 3 grams of simple powder could blow out most of the shrapnel and remove the lid is a testament to the power housed within. And here it is now at full speed for your viewing pleasure. You can hear the shrapnel, yes? Fun! What is really impressive is the fact that just 80 basic grains of flash powder were able to empty out the large majority of the shrapnel within this can. So imagine now if you had a fistful of tannerite to drop in there, and you added up in the size of the shrapnel involved. And here's a bit of last-minute fun that, just for the sake of it, we threw the can back down without the lid and stuck a firework under it. And we can watch it launch right at this moment here. I personally love this sound and this moment.
At Gallipoli, it got so sadistic with the explosives that they started to take smaller cans like this and then placed them in bigger cans like this. They'd fill these with the shrapnel and these with all explosives and just insert the two like so and then chuck them over at the enemy, which led to an incredible pressure barrier being released all at once. The fragmentation was absolutely intense from this kind of explosive. For the time being, however, in order to sleep in peace, I'm gonna light this and wish me the best.
And with that, my day was done. Now, let's move on to day 3. Well, it's certainly not possible for all conditions to stay dry forever, and in this case, a bit of a flash rainstorm hit us. So now, let's talk about what rain was like and those conditions were like at Gallipoli.
We are very fortunate right now that it had been such a light rainfall. It's actually pretty funny. I ran off fairly quickly. There is a protective awning over there at night for our film equipment, just to keep it safe. And I started throwing everything in the trench that really mattered, like most of our cameras, into the protective awning. It's really just a plastic bag and a chair to keep it safe. But as I was doing that, the rain essentially let up. My hat flowed downriver. I'm going to go collect that in a minute, but I have a spare here. But with this rain out in mind, I thought of a pretty good moment to talk on how did they deal with rain at Gallipoli. Well, the fact of the matter is they didn't deal with it very well at all. Especially in September when the rainy season came in, the trenches absolutely flooded. And it could get bitterly cold at nights, especially as the month moved on. In my case, we've had it very lucky. It really was not a hard rainfall. Most of this wool was actually pretty wicking. Just as I sat in the trench once I was finally done getting rid of everything that was important and electric, I decided it would be better not to sit in the mud, but instead to just kind of squat here. But in the trenches, they didn't have such luxury, and there were very few dry places. You would essentially dig a hole into the mud, hopefully store away your valuables, and even more likely, hopefully yourself, and that was the end of the day. Again, I'm very fortunate that it's such a nice, easy, light rainfall. I just hope it dries up tonight so I can actually sleep in these conditions a little better. Further, it's nice to have my backup Akubra here, but I'd like to fish mine out of the river. I am certain I can get to it eventually if it gets stuck in the dam. I'm going to leave for that now, but again, we have it much easier than they did.
Further, I'm just grateful that I don't have to sleep in this tonight because we're at the end of our 3-day shoot coming up. But still, I got lucky. A lot of our friends overseas did not. Also, don't worry, my Akubra was safely found, and maybe just before this shot, cleaned up a little bit. On November 22nd of 1915, the British government had decided it was time to evacuate the Gallipoli Peninsula and end the campaign. However, we're going to take this opportunity to discuss exactly what that looked like.
The weather really never improved at Gallipoli. In September, the rain was heavy. By November, the first snowfalls had come by. And soon enough, by December, people were freezing to death in their positions. The stalemate had been horrific, and conditions were never going to improve. It was by the beginning of December that the full call had been made to evacuate, and in the second week of December, they started moving troops out. However, in order to evade the Turkish soldiers, they had to be smart, and they had to not alert them that they were leaving the peninsula. So, they came up with several clever manners in order to make it look like there were more soldiers in the area than there really were. One of these methods is something called the pop rifle, or the self-firing rifle. And we're going to show you how to build one of those in simple right now. With the spare rifles that the ANZACs had lying around, they had a very simple but effective idea, either facing upwards or facing out towards the enemy and laying in dirt. They'd set their rifles with the safety now off, chamber one .303 bullet in, and then they'd position a simple tin of water like this on a string and tie it just here around the trigger. Then, overhead, they'd place a water bottle like so, angle it very carefully to start slowly dripping out. And every drop would add to the pressure of that, and slowly and surely, it would be enough weight to pull the trigger. So, we're going to do a simple experiment to show you how that works now. Give us just a minute, we'll have it propped.
Here is a prime, real-life example of a Gallipoli self-firing rifle, pop rifle, or drip rifle from the evacuation of 1915, just for the sake of historical comparison here. Our rifle will be standing and facing upwards, just so that the pressure builds up more quickly, but the best way to start this process is by taking your water bucket, keep it empty mind you, and tie a knot from that water bucket onto the trigger mechanism itself, so that we can get this started properly. At this juncture, we're now going to take our canteen, place it on an elevated position, and start the slow dripping process, in this case, through the string here, because that'll guide it more readily. Now, the time that it takes to make this happen can vary, and of course, watching water is a lot like watching paint dry, so we speed up the process here for you ever so slightly. In order to make this rifle fire, it took us slightly over 1 canteen's worth of water to get the trigger to pull.
Now, I'm certain many of you noticed that process there, we sped up more for demonstration, but still, this simple device saved a lot of lives, and the Turks never saw the ANZACs evacuate. Sometime by the early hours of December 20th, all of the ANZAC beaches were fully evacuated, with the last 20,000 men being taken off the beach in the course of just a few hours in near total darkness, and devices like this really helped to save the day. We are here now at the night of the 3rd day, and we've been out here for the 72 hours doing our best to show you what the ANZACs lived like in Gallipoli. We've slept in this trench, we've ate their food, we've tried to show you some of their tactics, some of their lifestyle to bring it home to you. However, of course, compared to the real 9-month engagement, this won't compare by any means. But still, we're going to finish up with how they evacuated, talk on that some more, and then we'll conclude from there. So excuse me now, I'm going to exit this trench and make my way to the water. Now in this situation, I'm just one man walking his way to the shore. However, for the ANZACs, they had a great deal to take care of. They would leave their trenches in groups of 400 men. They'd march single file, and in order to keep things quiet, they'd go barefoot, or they'd wrap their feet in rags and slowly make their way to the front line and then to the beach itself. In this process, some 40,000 rations were completely destroyed. Further, 5 million rounds of ammunition were dumped into the ocean, never to be seen again, which is really incredible. But most telling of all is going to be the fact that on December 19th, 20,000 men were evacuated. And on December 20th, the final 20,000 were evacuated. That's a testament to their secrecy and their own incredible ability. They really earned their title and their merit that day. Now follow me down to our little beach here. Ladies and gentlemen, here we are now at the very end of our discussion on Gallipoli. We've been out here for 72 hours, but frankly that's nothing compared to what they did at that time. Over the course of the Gallipoli campaign, roughly 8,700 Australians and 2,900 New Zealanders were killed in action, or would die from subsequent wounds later on attributed to Gallipoli. Although it was viewed as an incredible failure, in so many ways they were very close to winning that battle. Modern historians have found that if they had held out for just a few more months, it's highly likely that the Turks would have broken. But in this case, the Turkish soldiers were left with a victory. But the war was far from over. In these moments, it's important to remember that this was a defining moment in Australian and New Zealand history because it defined who they were as a people: strong, hardy, dependable, reliable, and most of all, a brave and honorable people. Further, it also proved who the Turkish were, again another honorable and brave people. But it also led to the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of the Turkish nation for the modern day and age. When the final ANZACs left the beach, they fired their rifles from their trenches one last time, came to the shore, released their hand grenades quietly into the water, and rowed away. At 4:10 a.m., pretty much all of ANZAC Cove was desolate and alone. At this point, we'd like everyone to remember that ANZAC Day is April 25th every year, and that day is a very well-earned day of remembrance, and we'd like to dedicate this to the memory of the ANZACs and to all who have served their nations honorably. Now, for anyone out there who enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe. Further, if you want to stay up to date with our team and what we're doing in the field, please follow us on our Instagram. We love to have a much broader conversation. And again, thank you to all of those in the historical and outdoors community who helped make this video possible, in particular our friends in Australia, New Zealand, and Turkey, who helped us to more better piece together the information here. We don't pretend that it's perfect by any means, but for people on such a small budget, we're happy to talk on it to the best of our ability. Now, boys and girls, if you excuse me, I'm going to make my way this way and exfiltrate from the film set. Until next time, boys and girls, this is the Eager Beaver, signing off.